by the early 80s, all of the social movements outside the academy were in retreat. And at the same time, what was happening inside the academy is that sort of new post-60s, disciplines, right, or areas, interest areas, Black studies, women's studies, Latino studies, were becoming institutionalized over the first half of the 80s, depending on where you were. It could be a tell that I think, with the exception of places like San Francisco State, they were institutionalized faster at the fancy places than at the less fancy places. But they became institutionalized, and they were institutionalized in a funny way, in a way that encouraged them, and I mean the disciplines, really, I mean not just the individuals, to make claims that were simultaneously intellectual and political, or academic and institutional and political. So when people start talking, like in the mid to late 80s, about a special Black epistemology or on the women's ways of knowing, that kind of stuff, I mean, these are more, at the same time, more or less genuine or honest expressions of a view of how the world works. I think a view of how the world works that's wrong fundamentally, but that's another matter. But they were that, as well as materially productive claim, or potentially productive claims about the status of the fields, right? And I mean, I'll say this, like I guess I should say it in duck, at least in a metaphorical way, but the notion, what was understood as Black feminism is a product of that moment of institutionalization. And I recall, like it was yesterday, I was teaching, right? And I've kept waiting for somebody to tell me what's special about Black feminism that's not encompassed either within Black studies or women's studies. And often enough, what it gets down to is, like, distribution of faculty lines and budgets and so forth and so on. And I'm not saying that to cast accusations at anybody, right? But that's just kind of a natural way that academic subfields and politics, develop, right? Like you get a certain kind of status if your area of study is recognized as a program. You get a different kind of status if it's recognized as a department. And it was so easy, especially given the history of those fields, right? I mean, their history as coming into the university from struggles that had been largely based outside the university.
And also, everything in the conception has to be a capital T theory. So in other words, it is self-evidently obvious to anyone living in the world that people are impressed in different ways. And if you're a woman, you could be oppressed in certain ways. And if you're Black in America, you could be oppressed in certain ways and whatnot. And presumably, if you're Black and you're a woman, you're oppressed in both ways. But that version of intersectionality is just an observation about certain facts, about oppression. It's not a complex theory about different ways in which these things intersect, and how we can't just be thinking about these siloed, or even just kind of, it's taken for granted, I think, on the left, that we cannot tackle one thing without tackling everything. And I there's that tendency towards carving out the space that is rooted in the fact that a lot of these ideas have been forged in academia as opposed to being forged in struggles. So when we think about the early workers movement, we're thinking about thinkers who are engaged in the process of building mass parties, or engaged in the process of trade union struggles. And this is where theory is intersecting with with reality, and they're constructing political programs and not just abstract ideas. And that's one reason why those things are more digestible and easier to communicate to people than theories that are crafted in academia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, I've been trying, well, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole behind intersectionality for many reasons, but I'll just say two things. One is that an irony about the notion is that it emerged partly as a response to criticism that the gross identity, or like the, I don't know, like the equivalent in the academic world of the continental identities, right? Race, gender, that they didn't cover everything, right? And that it was inadequate to posit something called a unitary singular Black interest or perspective, or a unitary singular women's interest or perspective. Part of the appeal of the intersectionality idea, and again, I remember this very well, was that it seemed to offer a promise to correct that limitation. But in fact, what it did was just the opposite, right? So it fractionates the identity. So there's more of them, but like each one of them is treated like it's rounded off, right, or bounded. And that's the other comment I wanted to make about it. Since I first started hearing about this 30 years ago plus, I've been asking, okay, well, how do you apportion, right? I mean, how do you know what's the woman's side of the intersecting Black woman identity, or what's the race side, and how do you draw the lines between them? And fundamentally, how does this look in the concrete world of everyday experience? And someplace or other, I posited like a laid off Black female single mother steel worker, right? With maybe some other characteristics, I can't recall. Which of those identities is the real one? And when I first read Patricia Hill Collins, who I've read before, I read Kimberly Crenshaw, like I thought, well, okay, but because she opens with what you see as a function of where you stand, right? Which, you know, was already not newsworthy with Mannheim, and maybe not even newsworthy with Marx, but Marx sure as hell was aware of it. But then the next move is, so therefore, as a Black woman, you know, only a Black woman can understand the experience of a Black woman. And I thought, well, wait, so why is that the only stop on the train, right? I mean, why doesn't it keep going, right? Only a left-handed Black woman can understand a left-handed Black woman. Only a left-handed Black woman under 5'2" can understand, you know, height challenge Black women, et cetera, et cetera. So there was never the argument about it, right? It always seemed to be a matter of a position looking for a theoretical justification. And then this takes me back to where I was going about the retreat of the left inside the academy, because again, this was more most prominent at the fancy places, right? But like, you know, into the 90s, people who operate in those fields of study wanted them, you know, understandably, to have appropriate recognition as academic disciplines. And then the next thing you know, so what do you want to do if you got an academic discipline? Well, we saw what happened with cultural studies when it was imported from the UK. It gets embedded in this discursive house of mirrors, right? That requires like high tech, or at least the appearance of high tech training to be able to interpret anything, while ironically setting itself against, you know, conventional hidebound master narratives, et cetera. So that's part of what happens. And then, quite accidentally, but even more insidiously, the notion of the public intellectual takes shape. And that idea came directly out of a book that my old comrade Russell Jacobin did called The Last Intellectuals. It was good in some ways and kind of romantic in some others, but the notion of a public intellectual as an academic, well, and that's not really what Jacobin was talking about either, but the notion of a public intellectual became an academic who comments on world affairs, and then somehow the boundary between academic work or other intellectual work and this public intellectual work dissolves, and all of a sudden, like everything is everything. And by the middle or the end of the 90s, you've got a world in which scholars who operate in the subfields or the areas of subfields that bear on people of color or women or gay or trans people as objects of study or fields of study, somehow along the way, the mission of the scholar becomes less doing work that's more narrowly gauged and directed toward a community of like-minded scholars, and I mean like-minded in the sense of people who specialize in the same areas, and becomes more a matter of doing something that looks from one angle more like public education, but it also feels like a public hectoring. And then there's this tendency to proclaim the work that, just to put it crudely and to fast forward a bit, the work that would get you into the guest chair on MSNBC, or even into the host chair if you're good enough, or if you're lucky enough, as being the equivalent of the scholarly work. And so, I mean, that's kind of where we are now.
Mm-hmm.